The bet. Lucas Montgomery had always been a man of certainty. In his world, everything had its place, and he was at the top of that order. At just 34, he was the CEO of a massive international conglomerate, a self-made billionaire who had built his empire from the ground up. Lucas wasn't just successful, he was untouchable. His empire stretched across industries, from technology and finance to luxury real estate and private aviation. Every business decision he made was backed by ruthlessness, a sharp intellect, and a relentless belief in the superiority of wealth. He viewed the world through the lens of numbers, profit, loss, assets, liabilities. The people in his orbit were either tools to be used or obstacles to be removed. He had no time for sentimentality or weakness. His days were spent in high-rise offices, private jets, and exclusive club lounges. He dined with celebrities, mingled with other moguls, and entertained himself with beautiful women who saw him as a symbol of power. To them, he was the epitome of success. To him, they were little more than accessories, disposable, replaceable, a reflection of his wealth and status. He didn't seek relationships or friendships, he had no use for them. In Lucas's world, everyone had a price, and those who couldn't afford to play his game were irrelevant. One evening, Lucas found himself in a plush, dimly lit private club in the heart of the city. The club was a haven for the rich and powerful, where the city's most influential gathered to talk business, sip rare whiskey, and indulge in decadent cigars. The VIP section was an exclusive domain, reserved for those who had proven their worth in the cutthroat world of high finance. Tonight, Lucas was surrounded by his usual crowd, a handful of men who had, like him, clawed their way to the top of the social ladder. As the conversation drifted, the topic turned to the ever-expanding gap between the ultra-wealthy elite and the rest of society. The men around him spoke with the kind of detached arrogance that came from having everything at their disposal. Lucas swirled his drink, his eyes scanning the room with an air of superiority. "Come on, let's be real here," Lucas said with a chuckle, leaning back in his seat, his voice oozing confidence. "People are poor because they make bad choices. They're lazy, complacent. They're comfortable with mediocrity, and they're too afraid to take risks. The world's divided into winners and losers, and the losers, well, they just get left behind." The table erupted into nods of agreement. Graham, a hedge fund mogul with a perpetually cynical air, grinned as he chimed in. "It's simple economics. The rich get richer, and the poor just stay stuck. It's survival of the fittest out there." Lucas felt a surge of satisfaction. His worldview was being validated by men who had walked the same path, men who understood the value of cold, calculated decisions. It was at that moment that Caleb Turner, one of his oldest and most respected rivals, spoke up. Caleb was not just a businessman, he was a competitor, someone who constantly tested Lucas's limits. Their relationship was more like a battle for supremacy, a game where both men played to win, no matter the cost. Caleb's eyes glinted with mischief as he leaned forward, the faintest of smiles playing on his lips. "You really believe that, don't you?" Lucas raised an eyebrow, amused by the challenge. "Of course. I wouldn't say it if I didn't." Caleb chuckled, clearly enjoying the direction the conversation was taking. "Then I bet you couldn't take a woman, a completely ordinary woman, someone with no connections to our world, and turn her life around. I'm talking about someone from the other side of the tracks, someone who has no idea what it means to live in luxury. Take her, give her everything, and show her what our world is like." The room fell silent for a moment. Lucas was intrigued. He had heard Caleb's challenges before, but this was different. It wasn't just about wealth, it was about power, control, and proving a point. "You're saying I couldn't take someone like that," Lucas said, a smirk spreading across his face. "A woman who has nothing. And I have to give her everything? What are the rules here? Is this some kind of twisted charity?" Caleb leaned back in his chair, enjoying the attention. "No charity. just a bet. You give her everything she needs, wealth, comfort, the life of luxury. But it's more than that. I'm betting you couldn't make her see the value of it. Make her understand why people like us are better, why we deserve what we have. Prove to me that someone without ambition can be made to see the light." Lucas considered this for a moment. To him, it seemed like the perfect challenge. After all, he was the man who could buy anything he wanted, fix any problem with money, and control any situation with sheer willpower. He had the power to make anyone bend to his will. "Fine," Lucas said, his voice smooth, confident. "But the woman has to be someone who has no idea about our world, someone completely outside of it. No connections. No ties. She has to be someone who's never even dreamed of living like us." Caleb raised his glass in acknowledgement. Deal. The bet was set, and Lucas had already begun to formulate a plan. He wasn't sure what kind of woman he would find, but he knew it wouldn't be difficult to pull the strings and make her into a pawn in his game. He would find someone desperate, someone struggling, and he would show her what it meant to be on top. In the end, Lucas had no doubt he would win. After all, what could a poor woman, with no wealth and no power, possibly know about the life of the rich? But as he left the club that night, with the challenge in his mind, something gnawed at the back of his consciousness. It was a small, fleeting thought, one that he quickly dismissed. But deep down, Lucas knew that he was about to enter a game far more complicated than he could ever have imagined. The next morning, Lucas began his search. He knew that the woman he was looking for would need to be someone completely disconnected from the world he inhabited. It couldn't be a woman who was used to comfort or luxury, someone who had seen a taste of wealth. No, this had to be someone raw, unrefined, someone who had no idea what she was stepping into. He began by researching impoverished neighborhoods, visiting community centers, and even volunteering at local shelters. It was a world Lucas had never paid attention to, a world he had never cared to understand. But now, it was a challenge, and Lucas was nothing if not determined. He found her in the most unexpected place, a small coffee shop tucked away in a corner of the city. Her name was Emily Collins. Emily was 28, with brown eyes that held a quiet intensity. She was a woman caught in the crossfire of a brutal life, struggling with a terminal cancer diagnosis, battling for survival against the odds. Her appearance was frail, her body weakened by the constant fight against the disease, but there was a fire in her eyes that told Lucas this was no ordinary woman. Lucas had expected someone broken, someone easy to manipulate. But Emily wasn't that. She had faced hardships no one should ever endure, yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity. She wasn't looking for pity or handouts. She was a survivor, fighting against a ticking clock, determined to live her remaining days with purpose. At first, Lucas didn't know what to make of her. This was supposed to be a game, a bet to prove his point, but as he watched her interact with others at the coffee shop, he realized that he was dealing with someone different. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't impressed by his wealth or his power. She didn't fawn over him or try to flatter him. In fact, Emily barely seemed to notice him at all. Lucas approached her with his usual charm, introducing himself as if he were just another wealthy benefactor looking for a cause. But when she looked up, her eyes didn't hold the awe he was used to seeing from people when they realized who he was. Instead, they were guarded, cautious. She didn't trust him. Lucas didn't know it then, but that was the moment everything changed. This wasn't going to be the game he had anticipated. Emily wasn't a pawn to be moved around on a board. She was a force, and in the coming days, Lucas would find himself questioning everything he had ever believed in. But for now, all he could think about was winning the bet. And Emily Collins, the woman with nothing, would become the key to his success. The plan. Lucas didn't waste time after his first encounter with Emily Collins. As a man who had built his empire on decisiveness and control, he quickly moved to put his plan into action. His world was one of luxury, power, and influence, and he was used to bending people to his will. He had never imagined that the woman he'd chosen for this bet would be any different. After all, Emily was nothing more than a sick woman on borrowed time, a woman whose life had been reduced to a struggle against an inevitable fate. He could afford to give her everything: money, health care, comfort, and make her see the world through his eyes. In his mind, this would be just another game, and he would win, just as he always did. Over the next few days, Lucas began to research Emily's life more carefully. He found out about her battle with cancer, how her body had been ravaged by the disease, how she had fought tirelessly against the odds with the strength of someone who had nothing left to lose. He learned about her small apartment in a rundown part of the city, the days she spent working multiple shifts at a coffee shop just to pay her bills. He knew the exact extent of her illness: terminal, stage 4 cancer, and the doctors had given her just a few months to live. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him: she was dying, but Lucas Montgomery was going to save her, in his own way. The more he learned about her life, the more he saw the perfect opportunity for his experiment. Emily was the perfect subject: weak, vulnerable, and in need of someone to take care of her. What Lucas hadn't anticipated, however, was that Emily wasn't someone easily controlled. She was strong, resilient, and fiercely independent. She wasn't about to be charmed or manipulated by a man like him. That first meeting in the coffee shop had shown him just how guarded she was. Something about him, or perhaps the world he represented, had triggered an instinctive wariness in her. Still, Lucas was determined. He wouldn't let something as trivial as a woman's refusal to bow to his power stop him. He could handle this. He had handled far tougher challenges in his life, after all. What would it take to break through that wall of resistance? He needed to get close to her, gain her trust, and then he could begin shaping her reality. Once he did that, once he showed her the world he inhabited, she would have no choice but to fall in line. He arranged to meet her again, but this time under different circumstances. Lucas knew that if he were to gain Emily's trust, he couldn't come at her with the same cold, calculating approach he had used with everyone else in his life. He would need to show vulnerability, to make her think that he genuinely cared about her. After all, that's what people like Emily wanted, wasn't it? A little care, a little kindness, especially when faced with death. Lucas wasn't used to playing the role of the savior, but for this game, he was willing to put on the act. The next time they met, it was under the guise of charity. He invited her to dinner at one of his upscale restaurants, a place where the rich dined on delicacies that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She hesitated at first, but Lucas, ever the smooth talker, convinced her. "It's just dinner," he said, his tone warm and persuasive. "No strings attached, just a chance to relax and take your mind off things." To his surprise, Emily accepted. Perhaps it was the idea of escaping the grind of her daily struggles, or maybe it was the allure of something she never thought possible, an invitation from a man who could give her a life she had only seen in movies. But what Lucas didn't understand was that Emily was far from impressed by his wealth. She wasn't some gold digger looking for a rich benefactor, she was a woman who had long since stopped expecting anything good to come her way. She had learned to take life as it came, finding small joys in the things that mattered most, like the kindness of strangers or the simple pleasure of a warm cup of coffee. As the night wore on, Lucas watched her intently. She was quiet at first, sipping her wine, taking small bites of the gourmet food with a modesty that didn't belong in the setting. It was as if she didn't even notice the extravagance around her. She wasn't impressed by the designer decor, the pristine white linens, or the staff that catered to every whim. To Emily, it was all just noise. She was in a different world, one that was so far removed from her own reality that it felt almost surreal. She told him about her life, her diagnosis, her struggle with the medical bills, the days spent lying in bed, exhausted, wondering if she would ever get to see another sunrise. But even as she spoke about the hardships, there was no self-pity in her voice. She wasn't asking for sympathy, and Lucas, for the first time, found himself uncertain. He wasn't used to dealing with people who didn't want something from him. He had always been able to fix problems with money, with power. But here was Emily, someone who didn't need his money, someone who didn't need anything from him at all. "Why me?" Emily asked, breaking the silence between them. "Why would someone like you even want to spend time with someone like me?" Lucas was caught off guard. It wasn't a question he had prepared for, and for a moment, he didn't know how to answer. He could have said it was because of the bet, that it was all part of some game to him. But he didn't. He found himself saying something entirely unexpected. "Because you're different," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You don't seem to care about the things everyone else does. You don't care about money, about status, you just live." Emily studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly. She was used to people making empty compliments, and she wasn't about to be fooled by his charm. "And what is it you want from me, Lucas?" she asked, her tone calm but with a sharp edge. "What's the catch?" Lucas hesitated. He had expected to manipulate the situation, to bend her to his will, but Emily's directness threw him off. She wasn't interested in his wealth, his power, or his charm. She wasn't going to be the object of his game. For the first time in his life, Lucas felt out of his depth. He wasn't in control of the situation, and it unnerved him. The power he had over everyone else, his employees, his business partners, even his fleeting romantic conquests, seemed to mean nothing in the face of Emily's quiet strength. This wasn't a woman who could be bought with money or swayed by influence. She wasn't interested in playing his game, and that was something Lucas had never encountered before. But he wasn't about to give up. He had made a bet, and Lucas Montgomery never backed down from a challenge. He would win this. He would make her see the world as he saw it. The more he got to know her, the more determined he became to win her over, not because he cared about her, but because he couldn't stand the idea of losing. Over the next few weeks, Lucas increased his efforts. He showered her with gifts, designer clothes, expensive treatments, lavish vacations, but Emily remained indifferent. She accepted the gifts, not out of greed, but out of a sense of pragmatism. She wasn't going to turn down what he offered, but she wasn't going to let it define her. The more he tried to impress her, the more he realized that Emily wasn't interested in his wealth. She didn't need it. Lucas started to visit her more often. He would show up unannounced, sitting with her at her apartment, talking to her about his businesses, his life. He began to share parts of himself that he had never revealed to anyone. For the first time, Lucas felt something close to vulnerability, a strange discomfort that came from realizing he wasn't the only one with power in this situation. Emily was teaching him something he wasn't prepared for. But even as Lucas began to change, even as he started to respect Emily in a way he hadn't expected, the truth about his bet loomed over them. He had made a promise to Caleb, and he couldn't back out. But the deeper he got into Emily's life, the more he began to question everything he had ever believed about power, about success, and about what really mattered in life. The clock was ticking. Emily's health was deteriorating. The bet was supposed to be about winning, but Lucas wasn't so sure anymore if it was a game he wanted to play. But it was too late to back out now. The consequences of his choices would soon catch up with him, and when they did, they would leave him speechless. The unraveling. The weeks that followed felt like a blur of contradictions. On the surface, Lucas continued his charade with Emily, showering her with attention and luxuries, but behind the facade, something inside him was shifting. The act he had perfected with the women who passed through his life had begun to wear thin in Emily's presence. Unlike his past lovers, who had been content with flattery and material gifts, Emily was indifferent to his wealth. She didn't need validation from him. Her existence, for better or worse, was built on a quiet strength that Lucas had never seen in anyone else. What unsettled him the most was the way Emily looked at him, not as if he were the successful billionaire, but as if he were just a man. He had expected gratitude, admiration, even reverence, but instead, she treated him with the same cautious distance she gave everyone. She didn't care for the grandeur he surrounded himself with, nor was she dazzled by his charm. She was more interested in the person behind the mask, something Lucas hadn't allowed anyone to do for years. Lucas found himself reflecting on his life, on his decisions, his empire, and the values he had built it upon. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every situation, to bend people to his will. He had used his wealth as a tool, a weapon to break down barriers and keep people in line. But with Emily, nothing seemed to work the way it should. She didn't want his power, and it became clear that she didn't want him, at least not in the way he had hoped. Their relationship had become an uncomfortable dance. He would show up at her apartment with more gifts, each more lavish than the last, but Emily's responses remained measured and polite. She accepted the presents, but she didn't fall for his flattery. She would smile, thank him, but quickly return to her routine, her quiet acceptance of life's uncertainties and struggles. It was frustrating for Lucas, but it was also oddly fascinating. One evening, Lucas arrived unannounced at her apartment. He had brought a bouquet of roses, but there was something different in his heart this time. For the first time since meeting Emily, he wasn't thinking about the bet. He wasn't thinking about winning. He found himself genuinely hoping to make her smile, to get her to soften toward him in a way that wasn't tied to his money or power. As he knocked on the door, he heard a faint sound from within, quiet, labored breathing, and the shuffle of feet across the floor. When Emily opened the door, she looked different. Her face was pale, her hair unkempt, and her eyes, once filled with fire, were now clouded with exhaustion. The fight that had once been in her seemed to have dimmed, replaced by a quiet resignation. The reality of her illness was sinking in, and Lucas felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. "Hey," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I brought you something." Emily glanced at the bouquet in his hand, then back at him. There was no enthusiasm in her expression. No spark of excitement. She simply nodded and stepped aside, allowing him in. "Thanks," she said softly, as if the gesture didn't really matter. She placed the bouquet on the kitchen counter without a word. Lucas stood in the entryway for a moment, unsure of what to say next. In the past, he would have launched into a conversation about his business ventures, or perhaps talked about the extravagant places he had visited recently. But here, in Emily's apartment, all of that seemed meaningless. Her world was small, confined to a few rooms, and her life was even smaller, defined by the constant battle with her disease. The excesses of his world seemed out of place here, as if they didn't belong. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice more tentative now. Emily sighed deeply, as if the question itself had exhausted her. She sat down on the couch, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't answer immediately, and Lucas took a seat beside her, unsure of what to do with himself. For the first time, he felt like an intruder in her life. "I'm fine," she said after a long pause. "Well, as fine as I can be, I guess." Lucas didn't know how to respond. He had never been good with people who didn't respond to his gestures, and he had never been in a position where he wasn't the one holding the power. He had always been the one in control, the one who dictated how things went, but with Emily, the dynamics were different. She wasn't intimidated by him. She wasn't interested in his money or his influence, and that made him feel small in a way he hadn't experienced before. "You know," he said, his voice taking on a quieter, more reflective tone, "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About how things are between us." Emily turned her head toward him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Have you?" she asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. "I mean it," Lucas said, looking at her with a sincerity that surprised even him. "I know this whole thing started because of the bet, but I don't want it to be just that anymore. I've been thinking about you, about how much strength you have." Emily didn't respond immediately, but Lucas could see the shift in her expression. She didn't say anything, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps hope, or maybe just the barest hint of acknowledgement. "You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for," Lucas continued. "You've been fighting every day, and you don't ask for anything in return. I've seen that. And I respect it." Emily's eyes softened for a brief moment, but she quickly masked it with a faint smile. "You don't have to say that," she said, her voice still quiet. "I'm not a charity case." Lucas opened his mouth to argue, but she held up a hand. "Look, I get it. I know you're trying to be nice, but I've lived long enough to know when people are being genuine and when they're just playing a part." For the first time, Lucas felt a pang of guilt. He had been playing a part all along. He had thought he could control the situation, manipulate the outcome, but Emily saw through him. She saw the man behind the polished exterior, and she wasn't fooled by his attempts to buy her affection. And that hurt in a way Lucas hadn't expected. "I'm not playing a part," Lucas said, his voice firm but quiet. "I care about you. And I'm sorry for the way I've treated you up until now." Emily looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm and steady. "I don't need you to apologize, Lucas. I don't need your money or your pity. I just need you to understand that I'm not some project for you to fix. I'm a person. I've always been a person." Lucas didn't know what to say. He had expected this conversation to go differently, but it was clear now that he had been wrong about her. She wasn't interested in being his experiment or his charity case. She didn't want his help, she didn't need his money. She just wanted to live the remainder of her days with dignity, something Lucas had never truly understood. As the evening wore on, the two of them sat in silence, the weight of the unspoken truth settling between them. Lucas was no longer sure of anything. The bet, the game, it all seemed so meaningless now. He had come into her life thinking he could change it, thinking he could prove his theory, but now he saw that Emily was beyond him. She didn't need fixing, and she certainly didn't need his wealth or influence. She was something entirely different, something real and raw, and that terrified him. But as the clock ticked on, Lucas realized something that shook him to his core. The more he got to know Emily, the more he realized that he wasn't the one who was going to change her. She was changing him. And that thought left him speechless. The walls crumble. Days stretched into weeks, and Lucas found himself walking a path he never thought he would. The world he had built around himself, a fortress of wealth, status, and control, was no longer a source of comfort. The more time he spent with Emily, the more those walls began to feel like a cage. She had opened a door in his soul, one he didn't even know existed, and through it, a flood of emotions and realizations had come pouring in. He had never imagined that he would come to care for someone like Emily. She was everything he had thought he could never be interested in, vulnerable, honest, stripped of pretense. In her presence, all his armor, the power, the money, the unshakable confidence, seemed insignificant. It felt like the more he got to know her, the more he lost control of the game he had been playing. Emily didn't play by the same rules, and somehow, she had begun to change him in ways he couldn't explain. Lucas found himself visiting her apartment more often, his motives shifting from the initial bet to something deeper, something far more personal. The extravagant gifts, the five-star dinners, the lavish getaways, he stopped offering them. They didn't matter to her, and that realization was unsettling. What mattered to her were moments of raw, unguarded honesty, simple things that Lucas had never truly appreciated before. A quiet conversation on the couch, her laughter at some silly joke, the way she would sit with him in the silence, letting her presence speak volumes when words failed. It was in the little things that Lucas began to understand what he had been missing his entire life. One rainy evening, Lucas arrived at Emily's apartment without any pretense. No gifts, no showy gestures, just himself. She opened the door, her face a little pale but her eyes bright, as they had been on their first meeting. Emily smiled faintly when she saw him, the kind of smile that held more weight than any other expression she had given him. "Hey," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "Hey," Lucas replied, his voice almost quieter than usual. He noticed how still the air was, how there was no rush, no urgency. Everything felt at a slower pace, more deliberate. She led him to the living room, and they both sank into the couch. The rain pattered against the windows, creating a soothing backdrop to their silence. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. There was a certain kind of peace in the stillness between them. Then, Emily finally broke the silence. "You're different," she said, her voice not accusing but thoughtful. "You don't seem the same as when we first met." Lucas leaned back, looking at her with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "You really think that?" Emily nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Yeah. At first, you were so guarded, so focused on this. I don't know, game, I guess. But now, it's like you're actually seeing me. Not the bet. Not the project. Just me." Lucas swallowed hard. Her words stung in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had come to this place under false pretenses, hoping to prove a point, to win a bet, but somewhere along the way, things had gotten more complicated. He had been playing a game, but Emily had never been a part of his rules. "I didn't mean to make you feel like that," he said, his voice more sincere than he had ever sounded before. "I never meant for it to be about a game. I don't even know how it happened. But you're right. I've changed." Emily studied him for a moment, and Lucas could almost hear the gears turning in her head. She had always been perceptive, a trait that made her even more captivating. She wasn't the type to be easily fooled, but now, there was something in her eyes, perhaps even a hint of hope, that made Lucas wonder if she was starting to believe that he could truly change. "You know," Emily said after a beat, "I don't know if I believe people change." "Not really. People like you, they do what they want, and then they convince themselves that they've evolved. It's part of the whole package, right?" Her words hit him like a slap, and Lucas had no immediate response. Emily wasn't wrong. In his world, change wasn't something that happened naturally. It was a calculated decision, a shift made for profit or for power. But with Emily, the changes he felt weren't deliberate. They were happening beneath his consciousness, like the slow erosion of stone by the force of water. And the truth was, Lucas wasn't sure if he could stop it. "I'm not pretending," he said quietly. "I'm not doing this because I want to win you over or prove something. I've never met anyone like you, Emily. And I know that sounds cliché, but it's true. You make me want to be a better person. I've never felt that way before." Emily was quiet for a long time, her eyes never leaving his. Finally, she spoke, her voice almost a whisper. "It's not enough to just want to change, Lucas. It's not enough to just feel sorry for the way you've acted. It's about actions. It's about showing up. Day after day. Not just when it's convenient or when you think I'll be impressed." Lucas absorbed her words in silence, his heart heavy with the weight of what she was saying. She wasn't asking for grand gestures. She wasn't asking for him to buy her love or to change for the sake of impressing her. She was asking him to show up. To be present, not just in the moments when he needed something, but in the moments when nothing was expected of him. "I know," he said finally, his voice softer now. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance. To prove that I can be something more than what I've been." Emily met his gaze with a steady, unreadable expression. "A chance isn't something I can just give. You'll have to earn it, Lucas. And I don't know if you're ready to do that. I'm not sure you understand what it means to really fight for something. To love without expecting anything in return." Her words, so simple yet profound, echoed in the silence of the room. Lucas didn't know what to say, but for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to fill the silence. He just sat there, with her, and listened. Maybe that was the beginning of real change, not in his wealth, not in his success, but in his understanding of what it meant to be human. As the evening wore on, Lucas began to see her in a new light. She wasn't just a sick woman fighting for her life. She was a woman who had already won the battle in her own heart. And he, for all his accomplishments, had never truly understood what it meant to live with that kind of strength. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like Emily had already won, while he had spent his entire life losing in ways he hadn't even realized. He had everything, yet he had nothing. And she, with so little, had more than he could ever dream of. Lucas had come into her life thinking he could control the narrative. But now, it seemed that the one who truly held the power wasn't him. It was Emily. And that realization left him breathless. She had given him a glimpse of something that money couldn't buy. Something far more precious than any luxury he had ever owned, the chance to be a better man. But as he sat beside her, knowing that time was running out, Lucas wondered if it was already too late. Would she ever believe in him the way he was starting to believe in himself? Would he ever be enough? Only time would tell. But for the first time in his life, Lucas was no longer sure that the game was worth winning. The heart's gamble. Days blurred into weeks, and Lucas found himself caught between two worlds. The towering skyscrapers of his empire, filled with riches and opportunities, seemed like a distant memory. He no longer felt the rush of conquering new heights in the corporate world. The thrill of an acquisition or a hostile takeover no longer held the allure it once did. What was all of that worth when it couldn't fill the emptiness inside him? Emily had become his paradox, his beautiful contradiction. She was fragile in the sense that her health was slipping away, but there was an unshakable strength in her that seemed to defy her condition. She didn't ask for sympathy, and when Lucas tried to offer it, she simply smiled softly, telling him that she had faced worse in her life than a few bad days. She never complained. But Lucas could see the quiet toll the illness was taking on her. The fatigue in her eyes, the way she moved a little slower, the occasional moments when the pain became too much, and she would hide her discomfort behind a veil of humor. Lucas watched all of this, and his feelings grew more complicated by the day. He couldn't help but admire her resilience, even though it hurt to see her suffer. She never asked for anything, yet she seemed to have a way of making him want to give her everything. Every time he thought he understood her, she surprised him with another layer of strength, another wall of pride that stood between her and the world's pity. One evening, they sat on her couch, the dim light from a nearby lamp casting a soft glow across her face. The steady rhythm of the rain outside mirrored the quiet tension between them. Emily had just returned from a doctor's appointment, her face a little more pale than usual, but she didn't say anything about it. She never did. She simply leaned back, her eyes meeting Lucas's with an intensity that made his heart race. "You're here again," she said with a small smile. "I didn't think I'd see you tonight." Lucas took a seat next to her, his gaze never leaving hers. "I should be here. I want to be here," he said quietly, the words feeling heavier than he expected. "I want to make sure you're okay." "I'm always okay," Emily replied, though there was a flicker of something in her voice, a trace of weariness that Lucas hadn't heard before. "But I appreciate it." Her response, while polite, hit him harder than he expected. She wasn't asking for his help, not in the way he had come to believe she would. Emily didn't need him to play the hero. She needed him to be human. And that realization brought a sudden wave of guilt crashing down on him. "Emily," he began, his voice faltering slightly, "I've been thinking a lot about us. About this whole situation, and I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know if I'm doing this for the right reasons. I started out doing this as a bet. It was a game to me. But now, I'm not sure what it is anymore." Emily's eyes softened, and she reached over, placing a hand gently on his arm. "You've changed, Lucas," she said, her voice calm, almost serene. "I can see that. But what matters now is not how you got here, but what you're willing to do with it." Her words were simple, but they were a lifeline. He had spent his life hiding behind wealth, behind the illusion of control, but now, Emily was offering him something far more precious than anything he had ever acquired in the corporate world, a chance to truly face himself, to strip away the layers of arrogance and pride, and to rebuild. But the path to redemption wasn't easy, and he wasn't sure he was ready to walk it. "I don't know if I can be the man you need," he admitted, his voice almost breaking under the weight of the confession. "I've made so many mistakes. I've hurt so many people. And I've hurt you, too, Emily. I know that." Emily squeezed his arm gently, a smile curling at the corners of her lips. "I don't need you to be perfect, Lucas. I just need you to be real. To be present. I don't need your money or your power. I don't even need you to fix everything. I just need you to show up, day after day, and care. That's enough for me." Her words were a balm to his soul, soothing a wound he hadn't realized was there. But there was still a part of him, an overwhelming, stubborn part, that wanted to fight it. It was too easy to fall back into old patterns, to let the walls around his heart rebuild, to convince himself that everything was still a game. But when he looked at Emily, at her strength and her vulnerability, he couldn't deny it anymore. She had won his heart in a way that no amount of money, no number of acquisitions, could ever compete with. "How did you become so strong?" he asked quietly, his voice full of awe. "How do you keep going, even when it feels like the world is against you?" Emily's gaze grew distant for a moment, and she let out a soft sigh. "I don't have a choice," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always had to keep going. Life doesn't stop, even when you want it to. I've had to fight for everything I've ever had. And that includes my life now. But I've learned something important along the way. Strength isn't about fighting all the time. Sometimes, it's about allowing yourself to be weak, to ask for help, to be vulnerable. It's about knowing when to stand tall and when to lean on someone else." Her words resonated deeply with Lucas, cutting through the armor he had built over the years. In that moment, he realized that he had been living his life backward. He had always focused on strength as something external, something to be wielded and controlled. But Emily was teaching him that true strength came from within, from the courage to be open, to love without expectations, and to accept the fragility of life. "How do I learn that?" Lucas asked, his voice thick with emotion. Emily turned to him, her expression softening. "You've already started, Lucas. You're here. You're trying. That's all you can do." But Lucas couldn't help the fear that crept in. He knew that time was running out. Emily's illness wasn't something that could be fixed with a few kind words or grand gestures. There was no way to undo the damage that had already been done. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop the inevitable. And that terrified him. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice raw with vulnerability. "I'm scared that I'll never be enough for you, that I'll fail you in the end." Emily smiled, a bittersweet smile that held a lifetime of understanding. "Lucas, you've already done more than anyone else has. You've shown up. And that's what matters." The rain outside continued to fall, but inside Emily's apartment, there was a quiet stillness, a fragile hope that seemed to hang in the air between them. Lucas felt a strange calmness wash over him. For the first time in years, he wasn't worried about the next big deal, the next acquisition, or the next conquest. He was simply here, in this moment, with Emily. And that was enough. But deep down, Lucas knew that the journey ahead would be far from easy. There were still so many things he needed to change, so many walls he needed to tear down. But with Emily by his side, he felt that maybe, just maybe, he could start to build a new kind of life, one that didn't revolve around winning, but around being present. And in that, he found something worth fighting for. As the night wore on, the silence between them grew more comfortable. Emily rested her head on his shoulder, and for the first time in a long time, Lucas felt something he hadn't in years: peace, the final bet. The days continued to slip by, but everything had shifted for Lucas. Emily, the woman he had once seen as an inconvenient bet, had become the only constant in a world that had once seemed invincible to him. The life of luxury, the empire of wealth, the power he had built on the backs of others, none of it mattered when compared to the gentle yet unshakable hold Emily had on his heart. Yet, despite the undeniable changes in him, Lucas still couldn't escape the lingering shadow of his original intentions. He had entered her life for all the wrong reasons. It wasn't something he could easily forget. Every now and then, he'd catch himself asking if he was truly the man Emily deserved, or if his actions were simply another way of trying to redeem himself for past mistakes. But the truth was, he didn't know what the answer was. Lucas spent his time alternating between working and visiting Emily. His company was as demanding as ever, but he no longer found the same thrill in climbing the corporate ladder. The rush of closing multi-million-dollar deals or the applause from a successful acquisition seemed empty when weighed against the warmth of Emily's hand in his or the quiet moments they shared together, watching the sunset from her modest apartment. One evening, as the cold of winter crept into the city, Lucas found himself sitting next to Emily, her delicate frame wrapped in a blanket. She was thinner than she used to be, her strength wearing down from the toll the cancer had taken on her body. It pained him to see it. But there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't dimmed. Despite her illness, despite the pain, Emily's resolve remained unbroken. "I've been thinking about something," Lucas said quietly, not wanting to disrupt the peace of the moment. Emily turned her head slightly, her eyes curious. "What is it?" "I've spent most of my life running from something," he admitted, looking away to gather his thoughts. "I've always been in control, always the one pulling the strings. I thought that if I could just build enough wealth, own enough things, I could escape the emptiness I felt inside. But I've realized something: I can't outrun it." Emily watched him closely, but said nothing. She simply waited, as she always did, for him to continue. "I thought I could fix everything. That I could solve this by making all the right moves," Lucas said, his voice full of frustration. "But there's something I've never told you. When I first came into your life, I didn't come here to save you. I came here because I thought I could win. It was a bet. A challenge, a game." His voice faltered as he forced himself to say the truth aloud. The words hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Emily didn't flinch, didn't pull away, didn't say a word. She simply reached over and placed her hand on his, her touch a gentle balm to his troubled soul. "I know," she said quietly, as if she'd already known all along. "You told me once, when we first met." Lucas's chest tightened as a flood of guilt washed over him. He had been so consumed by his own shame that he hadn't fully realized how much of it he had kept hidden from her. "But something changed, didn't it?" Emily asked, her voice soft but firm, a glimmer of wisdom shining through her pain. "You didn't need to be perfect, Lucas. You didn't need to fix anything. You just needed to show up. And you did." Tears threatened to break free from Lucas's eyes as he squeezed her hand. It was the first time in years he allowed himself to feel anything other than the cold calculations that had driven him for so long. "Why didn't I see it before?" he whispered, shaking his head. "I was so blinded by my own ego. I never really looked at you, Emily. I never really saw you. Not for who you are. I only saw a challenge, something I could conquer." Emily smiled softly, the faintest trace of sadness crossing her features. "It doesn't matter now, Lucas. What matters is what you do with this. What matters is who you are now." The words settled into his chest like a weight, but in that moment, they felt like the most beautiful truth he had ever heard. And then, in the quiet of that room, the reality of their situation hit him like a freight train. He was running out of time. Time with Emily. Time to fix what he had broken. Time to show her that his feelings were real, that he wasn't just another arrogant billionaire playing at something he didn't understand. "Emily," he began, his voice cracking as he spoke her name, "I don't have forever with you. I know that. But I promise you, I'm going to be the man you deserve. I'm going to show you what it means to really live. To really love." Her eyes glistened, her lips forming the faintest of smiles, though her body grew weaker by the day. "I already know, Lucas," she said, her voice gentle but strong. "I already know." Lucas leaned forward, pulling her into a tender embrace, wishing he could freeze time. He had never felt so out of control of his life, and yet, for the first time, it felt like he was finally where he needed to be. Days passed, and as winter turned to spring, Lucas continued his battle, not with corporate rivals or the endless tide of business deals, but with himself. He pushed to become the man he had promised Emily he would be. He started taking more time off, investing in causes that mattered, and most importantly, he spent every possible moment with her. But despite their shared moments of tenderness, Emily's condition worsened. Lucas could see the toll it was taking. He tried everything, he consulted doctors, brought in specialists, but nothing seemed to work. Time was running out. And one afternoon, as the golden light of the sun poured into her apartment, Emily turned to him, her voice faint and tired, but still filled with that unmistakable clarity. "Lucas, I know this is hard for you," she whispered, her eyes searching his. "But I need you to promise me something. Promise me that you'll live. Promise me that you won't let this be the end for you." Tears welled up in Lucas's eyes as he held her hand to his chest, his heart aching. "I promise," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll live for both of us, Emily. I swear I will." And as the days passed, Lucas found himself doing what he had never thought possible, letting go of the past, letting go of his empire, and learning how to love without fear. When Emily's time finally came, he was by her side, holding her hand as she took her last breath. The world outside continued to spin, but for Lucas, everything had changed. He had lost her, but in losing her, he had found himself. Emily had given him a gift that no amount of wealth could ever provide, the ability to truly live, to truly love, and to understand what it meant to be human. And in that final, painful moment, Lucas realized that he had won the greatest challenge of all, the one that had nothing to do with money or power. It was a victory that would stay with him for the rest of his life.